Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our Reclaim Network Plus webinar series. So this is webinar number 15th. Just to remind you that the Reclaim Network Plus is funded by the UKRI from 3 councils, EPSRC, NERC, and HRC. And there are 5 collaborating universities, including University of Warwick, Bangor, Bath, and UKCEH. So this is basically the team. So we got a diverse team coming from all these partner universities that is supported by our network manager, Mark Simmons, and we got our network fellow, and currently we got around 520 plus members, which represents over 45 countries across the world. So the whole idea of this webinar has been to share the best practices and facilitate knowledge exchange between practitioners, researchers, policymakers, businesses, and environmental groups. So usually this happens every month on Wednesday between 12:30 to 13:30. And the idea has been to have a mix-up of the speakers coming from the academic and non-academic, the side of things. So all these webinars are recorded, and you can see the recorded webinars on our YouTube page. So we'll paste the link in the chat box if you are interested to have a look in there. But you are also invited to be a speaker on the webinar. So you can do it in 2 ways. Either there is an online form you can see and fill that form, and you can get the response from there, or just write to us directly on info@reclaim-network.org, and then we can be in touch with you. So today, this is webinar number 15, and we got 2 speakers, one from Sao Paulo, and the other one comes from Denmark. So they will be talking about the very interesting topics in terms of the greening of urban areas, and then what could be the green and blue infrastructure in the city environment. So you will hear more about them. Before I go into introducing our first speaker, I just wanted to add a few housekeeping notes. So please use the Q&A chat function, which is on your screen, and type your question. You can add your name and affiliation. Each of our speakers will have 20 minutes, so we'll keep going with these 2 webinars first, and then we'll pick up those question and answer in the end. I have my colleague here, Professor Laurence Jones from the UKCEH, so he will be chairing the Q&A session. So you can write your questions in the chat box, and we'll pick up from there. All these webinars are recorded, and they will be put on the YouTube channel, and you will receive a link of the webinars in case if you wanted to have a look or wanted to share with your colleagues later on. So just to introduce the first speaker today, we have Professor Maria D. Fatima Andrade. So she's a full professor at Atmospheric Sciences Department in the University of Sao Paulo. She coordinates the Laboratory for Analysis of Atmospheric Processes, which is called LAPAT. She has a PhD in physics and has been working with atmospheric aerosols and air quality modeling for more than 30 years. And her projects are related to the description of emissions, transformation, removal processes of atmospheric constituents. One of the projects she's involved in is the use of green infrastructure to mitigate air pollution and the impact of climate change scenarios on health in southeast of Brazil. She's involved in the establishment of a greenhouse gas network measurement in Sao Paulo with FAPES funding involving many research groups. Since December 2020, she is member of Brazilian Academy of Sciences. Presently, she's also the member of WMO GAW Gourmet Science Advisory Group. So without further ado, so I'll pass on to Professor Andrade for her presentation.
Thank you for the introduction. I will start my presentation. Is that working? Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation for this presentation. Thank Reclaim Group. I am also a board member of this Reclaim. And today I'm going to talk about the greenhouse gas emissions in the case of Sao Paulo, Brazil. First, I will introduce some of the motivation for the measurement of CO2 at global scale, the importance of the cities for the greenhouse gas emissions, and Brazil and Sao Paulo, the emissions inventory of greenhouse gases, and the data that we have already collected about CO2 concentrations related to our microclimate project that I will explain a little bit later. Globally, we know that CO2 is increasing, and this data that I am showing here, it's from the WMO bulletin. Let's point the pointer here. The WMO bulletin about CO2 concentrations, and we can observe this increase with time of CO2. And also this in this part B of the figure, we have the CO2 growth rate that depending on the year, it has different values, but we can see this increase also in the growth rate of CO2 concentrations. When we compare the increase from 2021 to 1750, we have more than 140% of increase in the concentrations. The absolute increase is 2.5 ppm for CO2. This value is, you can see that it's not so high. And then to measure this kind of concentrations, we need a system that is calibrated and with standards, standards for the CO2 concentrations to have the precision to measure this kind of increase in concentrations. Historically, we all know that we have this killing curve that from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, that the name comes from the Charles Keeling, that received many distinctions for starting the measurements, for starting this observatory in Mauna Loa. Here it's looking from 2009 to 2023, more recent data, and it continues to increase. It has this variation during the year related to the photosynthesis process of the vegetation. This Mauna Loa Observatory is in the Pacific, is far from the emissions by the cities, from the anthropogenic emissions. It's considered to be a remote area. We have these 4 sites that are considered the remote and the background concentrations of CO2 in Alaska, in Hawaii, American Samoa, and South Pole. When we see the places, we have here the picture of the places, they are all remote areas, and some they have vegetation also, like here in American Samoa and in Mauna Loa in the summertime. Then when we look to this variation, the profile, the variation of CO2 with time, we note that in the places where we don't have the vegetation, like in the South Pole, the concentration, here is in the black for the South Pole, the concentrations vary very little during the year. That's very different from where we have vegetation, that then we can see the respiration process of the vegetation. And in the beginning, we have this variation that's also increasing. This is a curve to represent the increase, the growth of the concentrations, but more recent, this has the tax of the increase is also increasing. Well, these data are from remote areas, but why then cities are starting measuring also the greenhouse gas concentrations? First, because the cities and their energy demand are the main drivers for the emissions of greenhouse gases globally. The urbanization has concentrated more than half of the world's population. Also, it is responsible for 70% of fuel fuel carbon dioxide emissions for energy production. Also, we have a significant amount of methane being emitted by the surface, and the cities are occupying a small fraction. It's more or less 3% of the Earth area occupied by the urban areas. But although it is small in area, it's responsible for most of the emissions. And in Brazil, now more than 85% of the population lives in urban areas, but it's expected to be more than 90% by 2050. And also, why we need to measure the concentrations? Usually what we have globally for the cities and for the countries is emissions inventory, and it's global emissions inventory that are calculated based on emissions factor and activity of the source. Then we have the emissions factor, we have the sources, and then it's calculated the total amount of CO2 emitted to the atmosphere. But they all have a lot of uncertainties in this method of estimation of the total emission of carbon that's for the atmosphere. With the measurements, we can check this emissions inventory, and also we can have these total concentrations being connected to the total emissions and see how it works to improve and to decrease the uncertainty in the evaluation of the emissions. In the world, we have this kind of emission inventory for the cities. Here it's from a paper in Frontiers that the authors, they had the total emissions and they calculated the total emissions in the cities, but per capita emissions. And then it's quite interesting because sometimes when we calculate the emissions by population, we have different profiles and sometimes cities with high emissions, but when we divide by the number of people living in the area, we have much less emissions, like here in Brazil. And concerning the South America and the cities in Brazil, like Sao Paulo, Belo Horizonte, Rio de Janeiro, most of the emissions are related to process on-road transportation and industrial process. Here it's a picture of Brazil, and this is from an official data related to the emissions inventory for CO2, CH4. This is total CO2 equivalent emissions. What we have is for the cities, the biggest cities in Brazil, they're in the northeast of the country, and in the southeast, big cities like Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Vitória. And when we see this for sectors, the emissions by each sector, we have in the north part related to the agriculture, forestry, and other land use, and also mainly related to the burning of biomass out of the forests. In yellow here, it's livestock from animals, from cattle. Now the country can have a lot, but the energy use is mainly in the cities. Cities are responsible for the energy, for the CO2 related to the energy emissions. In Sao Paulo, we have the metropolitan area and we have the Sao Paulo city. In Sao Paulo city is 12 million inhabitants. In the metropolitan area is more than 21 million inhabitants. Mainly, the main source is the transport sector because of the cars and buses and everything. And another big part is from the energy sector that comes from industry. A small amount from waste. In Sao Paulo, we don't have a lot any energy. The energy is coming from hydropower and other kind of renewable energy. And then this stationary energy is from the emissions by the industry, by the process, not by generation the energy. And with this configuration, we started this Metroclima project. This Metroclima project is a project that is funded by the São Paulo Science Foundation, FAPESP, even includes a participation of many institutions, including the University of Surrey, with Professor Prashant Kumar participating also in this project. And then what was the main objective of this project was to start a network for measuring the greenhouse gas. We have already a network for pollutants, regulated pollutants, but then we start in 5 places measuring CO2 concentrations and CH4. The project framework, we have the modeling and the measurements together. Then we have people working with the modeling, and researchers who are also working with the measurements. And we have surface measurements. We are using satellite data, and we are using like this profile of concentrations. Also, this is for a ceilometer for boundary layer, but we have also profile for CO2 with FTRR. The goals of the project was that implementation of the network for greenhouse gas, development of emissions inventory. As I said in the beginning, it's important to know the total emissions, and the development of a transport modeling, atmospheric transport modeling, with including CO2 and CH4. That's different from describing the air quality, because in the air quality we have these reactions, but we are not so worried about the biosphere. But for the greenhouse gas, the biosphere is quite important to be well represented. And also at the end, we with the help of this modeling, to estimate the impact of the climate change feedback on air quality in the metropolitan area of Sao Paulo. I will here present some data as example for Pico do Jaraguá, that's a remote site. This remote site is in a place on the top of the high mountain of the city. Is a site, this is our institute in the campus of the university. We have also a site that's in the middle of the city with very few vegetation, and one that's in the park. This park is also being considered for the Green Cities project. It's a park where we have, it's the biggest park in the city with the vegetation. Another site is ICESP, that is in the top of the Institute of Cancer in Sao Paulo. It's a high building with 100 meters. São Paulo is not so far from the sea in a direct line. It's more or less 50 kilometers, but it's quite high, it's a plateau, 700 meters above the sea level. The city is in this plateau. You can see this urban land. And for instance, in the Pico do Jaraguá station that we are considering as a background place, it's not exactly a background, but it's the place that's more far from the middle of the urban area. We have this station with the equipment there, and there we are using this Picarro instrumentation, and this is the gas standard. I'd like to show now, we are measuring from 2020. At this place, we have data since from 2020 to 2023. We can see the increase. This is quite interesting because at the other sites, we cannot see this profile so clearly, that the increase in the concentration, it's the average concentration, a daily hour concentration from 2020. And we can see that in 2023, the concentrations are high. This profile with this very variation from the early morning to the midday is due to the effect of the respiration by the vegetation. Then we have this decrease in the concentration associated to the photosynthesis. During the night, we have also the impact of the vegetation, and in the morning, we have the impact of the emissions by the sources that the main sources are the vehicular emissions. I'm not going to discuss the CH, here is CH4, sorry for the mistake. We also have the variation during the seasonal variation, And for this remote area also, we see that during the springtime, we have the highest concentrations. It's because of this association with the heat and also the more impact of the vegetation. But it depends on the type of vegetation now. The other place, the IAG campus, we have also the measurements, and we can observe that the concentrations also increase in 2022. We had problems last year, and then the average is not for all the period, the same behavior. And the last station that I'd like to show is the station where we have less vegetation, and then the profile is different. And also the season profile is also different with the highest concentrations during the winter time. We have also the average of the concentration considering all the years and the comparison among these stations. And we can see the highest concentrations occurring at the station where we had less vegetation, but the profile are quite different because we are not only looking to the emissions, but also the absorption process by the vegetation with the photosynthesis. I'm not going to take too long here because I would like to show some examples of applications. This is the considering the average for all the years. And if you have time later, we can discuss more, but it's possible to see that during the night, the effect of emissions, boundary layer, and vegetation. And during the day, we can see that Pico do Jaraguá has a very low concentrations with IAG also, because they have more vegetation, and the place where we have less vegetation, it can be urban vegetation, then doesn't matter, the concentrations are high. This difference is associated with not only the emissions, but also the whole of the biosphere in absorbing the CO2. We had this work that was performed to try to evaluate if we can use the Pico do Jaraguá as a background station. And what was done is in black, we have the concentration data from 2019 to 2022. In red, it's the filtered data. It was used as a statistical filter. And then in blue is this smooth curve calculated to be the background. We have some criteria to define these background concentrations, but when we look here for the background and the measured concentrations, it is nice to observe that in the first month of lockdown due to the COVID in April 2020, the two concentrations are quite close, showing the consistency of the data. When we calculate the increase in the concentrations, we see that the rate of the increase is similar to that found by NOAA and published by NOAA of 2.5 ppm per year, considering these 2 years, 2019 to 2022. And the excess of the concentration, it was found to be 4 ppm between this period of time of 2 years. Another example that I'd like to show is that's also occurred in 2020, was an event of high biomass burning in central Brazil in September 2020. What we have here in Sao Paulo, in the urban area of Sao Paulo, sometimes is this effect of the forest wildfires, the plume coming to the city, and also the sugarcane burning, bringing this plume to the city. As at some periods of the year, we observe the contribution from this long-range transport of biomass burning. What happened in September 2020 was that we had high values of concentrations of CO2 in these 3 stations, IAG, Unicid, and Pico do Jaraguá. Also, at the same time, we observed high concentrations of PM 2.5 in the air quality stations managed by our environmental agency. And also we measured the delta 13 of carbon in the EAG station, and in the delta 13 of carbon, it was possible to see the sign of biomass burning during the events of high concentrations of PM2.5 and also high concentrations of CO2. Here it's a satellite image showing the plume. Here is the central part of the country. Here is Brazil, the coast, and bringing the plume to the city of Sao Paulo. And with this data and with the information regarding this delta 13 of carbon, it was possible to evaluate the sources of pollutants of the carbon to the atmosphere. It was possible to separate the fossil fuel, wood burning, ethanol, sugarcane, and forest wildfire. And here is for no event days, it's common days, and this is for the event days during September. Then it was possible to see the impact of the sugarcane and the forest wildfire. This evaluation was also made for these days in September with high concentrations. And to do this analysis, it was considered this source characterization with the delta 13 of carbon and the relation between CO to CO2 in these different sources: fuel, forest, wildfire, wood burning, and ethanol, sugarcane burning. This kind of signature for the delta 13 allowed us, with other data about the fuel burning in Sao Paulo, to evaluate the impact of each source. This is an example to show the application, how it's important, because then we had the concentrations, and with this kind of analysis, we could also evaluate the amount of how each source impacts the air quality and CO2 emissions. With this, I'd like to finish, and the summary here and recommendations is that this is an example of a collaborative work. And with this collaborative work, it was possible that we associate these carbon emissions in Sao Paulo, and we found how much is energy and the transport sector and the biomass burning. For this, we need to have all this data. Sometimes we ask why we are measuring for so many years, but it's quite necessary because each year has its own characteristic in terms of meteorology, transport, plume transport from other sources. But to do this, we need this international coordination, also to develop best practice, and also to be possible to maintain this kind of network. With this, I'd like to thank you and invite you to visit our website of our project. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima, for a very interesting presentation. If you have any questions on Fatima, please use the Q&A function and type your question. We will pick those questions towards the end of our second talk. So I take now the opportunity to invite Rene Sommer, who comes from Denmark, where he trained as an architect and urban planner. He worked with the city of Copenhagen for nearly 10 years, most of which he spent as the project manager and subsequently director of the Copenhagen climate-resistant neighborhood project called Climate Water, a project demonstrating new approaches to climate adaptation, which included using green infrastructure to make streets both beautiful and resilient. After Climate Water, he worked as an advisor, integrating the added value approach into city-wide cloud-burst management program. But when an opportunity arose to take a sabbatical year in Scotland, that year has quickly turned into 6 years, and he has shifted to working mainly in active travel, first as consultant and most recently as an urban designer, where he's heavily involved in the prestigious George Street design project in the heart of Edinburgh's World Heritage Site. So welcome, Rene. We are looking forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. I hope that you can see me, and I've had some IT issues, but I hope that I can share my screen now. And if that works. I'm going to assume, unless someone tells me otherwise, that you're seeing my presentation named Placemaking Infrastructure. And yeah, as I was just introduced, I come from Denmark. I live in Edinburgh in Scotland, and I've been up here for, coming on 6 years. And I work a lot in Scotland, but my presentation will be kind of linking between my work and the experience from Copenhagen and the way that we work with infrastructure in Atkins, which is one of the largest infrastructure consultancies here in the UK. And I'll both reach into some of the green infrastructure work that I've done with climate resilience, climate adaptation. And as mentioned, I'm working a lot in active travel and livable neighborhoods, livable cities at the moment. So going through this, all of these things will say how we work with infrastructure, and at Atkins really saying infrastructure investments is not just big, heavy CO2 emitting elements, but they can actually be part of creating livable cities. So a thing that is happening in many cities across the world, these pictures are from Edinburgh from a couple of years ago, but obviously Copenhagen experienced same things, and basically most of the news, spring, summer, fall, you see massive floodings happening around cities. And that is just a call for infrastructure investments. Most cities are built with what is by now kind of outdated infrastructure, combined sewer systems. So when we have these heavy rains, the sewers flood, and it would be detrimental enough if it were rainwater, but quite often it's gray water, groundwater that floods our streets and costs a lot of money. So a lot of cities are seeing the need to invest in new infrastructure. And when I worked in Copenhagen, one of the things that we did there is we're trying to change the whole city, make it more resilient to climate change, make it more resilient to the effects and these heavy rainfalls, but do it in a way where it adds value both to the city as a whole, but also to the neighborhoods that we were working in. So these images are from a square called Tåsingeplads. Tåsinge Square, it's in the north of the city. And actually pretty much all of what you're seeing on the picture on the left used to be asphalt. So it was two streets converging into one at a junction. And we managed to close off one of the streets and turn it into a small square and take this triangle between them and turn it into a large, water retention area. But instead of just making a large magazine, which could have been below ground, or instead of just making a large hole in the ground, we created this, this rainwater park, essentially, which when it rains can flood and can take in all of the rain and keep that rain out of the neighboring basements and the buildings around the square. But also when it's not raining, it brings some value to the square. So it's a place where, with the small play elements, and there's a cafe just out of the picture, so people can gather, people can sit there, people can enjoy the greenery, they can enjoy the seating. So even when it doesn't rain, it brings value. And really Copenhagen's approach to climate adaptation has been this, trying to take a whole city approach, understanding where does water fall, when it falls, where does it run, where are the areas that come into the most problems, and how can we use the investment that is required to ensure that the city can withstand these higher rainfalls. How can we use that investment to make infrastructure that adds both to the technical requirements in terms of climate change and in terms of rainwater, but that also can add to the quality of the neighborhoods that we're working in and the city as a whole. And while I know that it's not quite the same, a lot of my advocacy at the moment in terms of active travel infrastructure is really to say that active travel infrastructure is much more than asphalt, it's more than cycle tracks. It is something that can be used as part of placemaking, as part of creating livable neighborhoods and attractive cities that we're in. So again, going back to Copenhagen, Copenhagen is quite well known for being very ambitious in terms of climate targets. It wants to be carbon neutral by 2025. It's very ambitious in terms of its cycling infrastructure. It is probably one of the best cities in the world for cycling, although the Dutch would say that they're much better, which to a large extent I agree with, but Copenhagen is very, very good in that regard. But what is important is that they've managed to create a scenario where more than half of the people visiting Copenhagen at this moment in time are coming there by bicycle. So, or I should say, the majority of people coming into Copenhagen come in by bicycle. So people visiting the center of Copenhagen, it's been the case for a long time that residents of Copenhagen, by something like 60 or 70%, used their bikes on a daily basis. But this is all the people using Copenhagen. So also people from the municipalities around Copenhagen, the majority are now using bikes to get into the city. And that is not only because the cycle tracks are there and are good, but it's because it's convenient and because Copenhagen as a city has been planned and designed to encourage certain uses that happen to be sustainable. But if you ask the general Copenhagener why they choose to cycle, very few of them are going to say that it's because I'm trying to save the environment or I'm trying to get fit. It's really just because it's the fastest and the most convenient way to get around. And that's a really good principle that it is also happening in the UK, and it's coming a bit slower than Copenhagen, but it's really a very good principle to carry on. Try to make cycling and active travel convenient. Try to make it easy to use your bike to get around. And that's the principle of this kind of the 15-minute city or the 20-minute neighborhood, as it's used quite often in Scotland, at least, is the idea that you design neighborhoods and you design these areas to ensure that people can reach most of those locations and most of those functions that they require to have a high quality everyday life within an easy walk or cycle ride. It's not to say that you can't go outside of your local area, and it's not to say that you can't drive if it's the most appropriate solution at that time. It's really to say that in many scenarios, you can design the city so that cycling or walking is the most appropriate solution. If you consider just how far you can get by walking, it's a small area. By public transport, which is another sustainable mode of transport, you can get a bit further afield. But these isochrones from Edinburgh are actually showing that the 15-minute city in Edinburgh covers pretty much all of the inner city because it's really quite dense and easy to get around. So it already exists, but if we want to encourage more people to use cycle as their primary mode of transport, you need to make it easier. Now I will attempt to shift around and I'll have this video running in the background if all goes well. I'm not sure if the sound will carry on to use. I'll just take it off and say roughly what they're saying. The best tool for the job. They're saying that that's a quirky expression. What does it actually mean? It doesn't mean that other tools are wrong. It just means that depending on what you're doing, depending on what you're trying to achieve, choose the best tool for the job. And in most urban contexts, actually, cycling is the easiest and the fastest way to get around if you're doing short journeys, if you're going to school, if you're going to the shop to pick up 5 things. Maybe you don't need a large gas-guzzling SUV. Maybe you can just do it by bike. And similarly, in that way, it's really changing the understanding of what cycling is and how we design for cycling, because what happens often is that cycling is thought of in kind of the standards of highways engineering. And these are the typical images I meet quite often when I'm out speaking to people about cycling. But these are road cycles. These are race bikes. This would be equivalent to saying that you're trying to design a local residential community and the car that you use as your design vehicle is a Formula One race car. It's not to say that it's not good to cycle in this way, it is, but there are appropriate contexts for it. And I like the fact in Denmark, it's quite distinct. So there are these 2 words I've highlighted, landevejsrace and samtalecykelstier. Landevejsrace means, racing in a countryside road. Samtalecykelstier means conversational cycle paths. And the principle in Copenhagen is that the designs of cycle tracks, cycle paths should be that you should be able to cycle with a friend, having a conversation, and still allow a third cycle to overtake you. It's really about having slow cycling, convenient and pleasant cycling, where you might choose to cycle even with a friend because you can use that cycle to catch up on things. There was a policy, and that's one of the things when I was an urban planner in Copenhagen. It's a joy to work with politicians who have very explicit and very ambitious goals, but there was a goal to say that all cycle tracks should be designed so that you can cycle with a cup of coffee in your cup holder and it doesn't spill over. And that's really saying, if we want to encourage more people to cycle, we need to make it as convenient and as pleasant to cycle as it would be to take the car. So why shouldn't you be able to drink a cup of coffee while you're cycling? You can do that if you're sitting in your car. And if you've got a 20-minute commute in a car or in a bike, you want to make it as pleasant on a bike. Some of these principles are really something that I think that would change the approach to designing more sustainable cities, more sustainable transport within the cities. And it's also something that encourages us to consider the experience of going through a route, not just as a road, but actually what you're passing on the road. So greener cities is also where greenery that you pass along the road makes your experience more pleasant. So final Copenhagen example is Strøget, the walking street that used to be filled with cars, and a radical planner a while back managed to convince the politicians to test it out to block off cars completely. And well, step by step, it came to a point where it was completely pedestrianized. So Strøget is the longest, or at least was the longest pedestrianized street in the world for a good while. It's some of the highest value real estate in the city because people go there to spend their time, but, and I should say this to the politicians, also to spend their money. And that's what we're trying to achieve in livable cities. It's getting people to their neighborhood, spending their time outside, spending their money outside, developing the neighborhood, revitalizing it. And what we're trying to do with livable neighborhoods in Scotland is really understanding the place and the context that you're working with and designing the appropriate tool, or designing with the appropriate tool for the job. If there are any transport people in the house, they might know this matrix of kind of looking at how much place potential or place function a location has and how much movement function it has. So there are some streets that are just pure motorways and just meant to, move people. And there are other streets where you might be able to drive, but the function is to get there, to get to a location and to allow people to be together in that location. And it really depends on what type of context you're working in, what the appropriate tool for the job is. So for one example, in Ashgrove Road in Aberdeen, which is a project that we worked on last year, this is a largely residential area on the outskirts of Aberdeen. And what we were trying to show here is that you can encourage cycling and you can get more people to cycle into the city if they have a safe infrastructure to use and if it's comfortable, if there are pleasant things that you pass by, so greenery and small locations where you can sit down. But it's not a placemaking project per se. It's not trying to encourage people to stay in this local area. It's really showing that putting in cycle tracks doesn't take away from the wider function of the road, which is to move people between A and B. So the appropriate solution in that scenario is movement focused. Another example in Pollokshaws in Glasgow was, say, this is a part of a little neighborhood project where there was a request for better active travel infrastructure, but it's really saying active travel infrastructure isn't just cycle tracks. So I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but the orange bit is the cycle track, but actually the project is a much wider area. So we're working also with a local community park, a small street called Christian Street. We're proposing closing that off to traffic, so making it a more pleasant place. You can walk and cycle there, but you won't drive your motor vehicle there. The small square, Toonhouse Square, to the bottom right on my chart, actually is a cycle connection, but it's not designed as a cycle track. It's explicitly designed as a square that you can cycle across, because it's trying to encourage people to go there and to meet there. And similarly, if you're trying to design a square in the middle of the city, you won't put a road through it. You may have a cobbled street that allows vehicles to pass through if they're really required to, but you can design the project in a way that encourages certain behavior. And the last project that I'm going to show, I'm just checking on my side how much time I've left. I know we have a couple of minutes, but just to say, George Street, which is in the city centre of Edinburgh, it is an active travel project, and it's a project where we're making it better for people cycling, but where we've chosen not to put in a cycle track because that isn't appropriate for the context. So the context is the Edinburgh New Town, this historical area planned in 1700s, and George Street sits right in the middle of it as the spine through Edinburgh's New Town. Currently, while it is part of a UNESCO World Heritage designation, George Street over time has pretty much turned into a parking lot. So you'll see the center of this road is just cars parked all the way through, which means that you don't really get the heritage qualities of the street. You don't see the beautiful buildings, you don't notice it. It's not very easy to walk across it, and it's quite a long street with not a lot of crossing opportunities. So what we've been doing here is trying to change this scenario into, hopefully, this scenario. As you'll see, there still is a road, but it's going to be blocked off for general traffic. It's going to be a cycle street with access for, loading, servicing, the shops, still blue badge parking and blue badge access, but largely it's going to be free of motor traffic, and it's going to be given back to residents who can walk, but who can also sit there and just stay in the street and enjoy the street. As I mentioned, spend their time, spend their money in the street, reinvigorate the city center, and encourage active travel as this east-west connection through the city center. I'll just finish up with some images of the street as it looks today and as it will look in the future, to get this sense of how we're changing the feeling of the street, changing the context. And there are these large open spaces where you can see some of the beautiful buildings, and it's really encouraging everyone to slow right down. If there is the occasional vehicle driving through, it can only go slow. There's going to be ramps and speed bumps along the way, and they apply just as well to cyclists. So this is not a cycle superhighway. This is a street where it's easy and safe to cycle, but where everything is really quite slow to take in the experience, to take in the beauty of the street, to take in the beauty of the planting, changing it from, holding vehicles to holding these beautiful dwell zones, green areas that also function as part of the street's drainage strategy. So these are, some are raised planters and some are lowered rain gardens that connect to a voided subsurface that connects all of the surface water from the area. So in this way, substantially changing the street, bringing it into the future while retaining and enhancing the heritage values. And I think I will end it there.
Thank you very much, Rene. Very interesting presentation again. I'm going to pass it on to Professor Jones, actually, so for taking over the question and answer session.
Okay, well, thank you both for those very interesting talks. So if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat. So I have one question first for Maria de Fatima. So the question is about the kind of relationships between the carbon dioxide plots and the methane plots. And the question is asking, why do they follow the same sort of profile when the processes underlying, methane exchange are different from CO2?
Yeah, it's a good question. Here in Sao Paulo, we use for the vehicles also gas, and the gas is methane. Then it's easy to see these two peaks in the morning and in the afternoon that are similar to the peaks of CO2 related to the vehicular emissions. We have the other sources, but this made this the format of the curve be quite similar because of the vehicular emissions. We have the fuel is ethanol, is gasoline with ethanol, but also mainly for the taxis, they use gas. That's natural vehicular gas that comes from, that has methane in the composition.
So essentially it's vehicular emissions, not natural emissions of the methane.
No. Also, we have some emissions from waste management, but the treatment of the waste is more in the border of the city. But there we have also high emissions of methane. But these measurements in the middle of the city are very much related to the vehicles.
Okay, and I have another question for you. So the focus of the study is on looking at sources of greenhouse gas emissions, but I was wondering if you'd thought about some sort of extension of the work to look at carbon budgets. So for example, can you calculate the total amount of carbon removed by one of your parks, for example, over the course of a year?
Yeah, you see, this was first considered, but now with the Green City project, it starts to be a main issue in the project to try to relate to the amount of carbon storage by the vegetation. You know, at the beginning was like one factor influencing the behavior of CO2, but now with our Green City, it starts to be a main issue, how to evaluate the amount of storage according to the kind of soil or the land use we have.
Thank you very much. And I have a question for Rene. So you presented lots of examples of work in Copenhagen and various UK cities in Scotland. How, particularly for the work in Scotland, how are you measuring the success of these schemes? What kind of monitoring data is collected, and how do you assess success?
So the majority of the projects are funded through active travel funding from Transport Scotland. So the core of the monitoring and evaluation is related to active travel, and effectively, do we get people on bikes and how many people use the cycle infrastructure. But because they are placemaking focused projects and because they are so-called livable neighborhoods, there are a lot of kind of, I dare call them secondary monitoring elements. So we are looking at the community support for the projects. A lot of them sit in high street areas. So we're also trying to, again, ensure that businesses who are there continue to thrive, and ideally that more businesses open. So that's also something that we're looking at and monitoring. But yeah, the core elements are people movement, public life surveys in terms of pedestrian movements, stationary activities, and then cycle movements.
So you are doing some monitoring of co-benefits, it sounds like, but that's more social focused. So is there any kind of monitoring that might assess benefits of, because you are making these places, or proposing to make them more green than they are currently, so you're going to be planting trees or shrubs. Is there any planned monitoring to look at some of the biophysical benefits in terms of, perhaps air quality or amount of carbon stored, those sorts of ideas? Can you hear me, Rene?
I'm not 100%. I'm not 100% sure I heard everything. But
do you want me to repeat?
If I heard, were you asking whether there's also monitoring of air quality and?
Yeah, some of the other co-benefits, so air quality, carbon, water flow, those sorts of things.
Yes, so the projects that sit in so in Edinburgh, I can say at least, we do have kind of air quality monitoring also. The main assumption, I guess, is that if you do manage to have this change of use so that more people cycle, and ideally in that situation, fewer people take private cars, that will also have a positive effect on air quality. And of course, the locations where we have a lot of greenery, that is also something that will have an effect. But a lot of the projects that I'm focusing on are urban projects. So while we are definitely including more urban greening, the primary effect, I would assume at this point, in terms of air quality will be the reduction in vehicle use or emitting vehicles.
Okay, thank you very much. There aren't any more questions for the moment, and I think we're getting close to finishing, so I'll hand back to Professor Kumar. Thank you both.
Thank you very much, Professor Jones. I think before we close this session, I would like to introduce you to the upcoming talks. So there are two very interesting talks on 6th of September. So the one is from the University of Bath, and you will hear about the green and blue infrastructure to mitigate the urban heat island and promote climate resilience. And then the another one is Professor Feng Wang from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and she will be talking about the soil environment and the sustainable development. So if you are not yet a member of the network, so you could sign up by using the web link which is given above, which is the reclaim-network.org, and you can start receiving the updates. And if you are on Twitter or on LinkedIn, we have got the presence, so you can also follow us and you can get some of the updates. And interestingly, the Twitter has changed their sign last week, so I guess we might be changing another sign now, which looks like an X actually there rather than a tweeting word. But if you have any information about, if you wanted to know more about the network, you can write us on info@reclaim-network.org, or can write to any of the team members you know from the network, and we will come back to you. This webinar is recorded and will be available to you on the YouTube link, and you will receive it as part of the newsletter, the monthly newsletter. But also the emails usually we send once we have got all these ready there. But before we finish, I would like to thank to both our speakers, Professor Fatima Andrade and Rene Sommer Lindsay, for fantastic presentations. They covered a very broad range of the topics, and which are very important in the real world kind of applications. And also thanks to our Reclaim team member who have been working really hard in the background. And this has been the 15th webinar, and we haven't missed a single one actually since we started. So thanks to Charlotte, Mark, and Cisse in the background. And thanks to Professor Jones for chairing this session. So we'll see you in the next webinar. Thank you.